Hey guys, tonight we walk quietly into a dimly lit office where the air smells faintly of ink, dust, and stale coffee, and you can almost hear the soft scrape of a chair as someone leans forward to sign a form that will change lives far away. You are standing there in the present tense, watching a stack of papers wait patiently, as if they have nowhere better to be. Outside, somewhere distant, a train whistle moans. But in this room, nothing feels dramatic. That's the unsettling part. You probably won't survive this, not because of explosions or heroic last stands, but because history shows how easy it is to be worn down by routine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, go ahead and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are looking at orders. Just orders. Typed, stamped, numbered. In World War II, some of the worst atrocities did not begin with shouting or violence, but with calm instructions written in careful language. A mainstream historical fact that still chills historians is that many mass crimes were organized through official channels, using memos, schedules, and regulations that look no different from ordinary administrative work. The paper itself never trembles. The hand signing it might pause for a second, but the pause rarely lasts. You imagine yourself as a junior officer, or maybe a clerk, told simply to pass something along. You don't see victims, you see folders. You don't hear screams. You hear the soft thump of a stamp hitting ink. Then paper. Thud. Approved. There's a strange comfort in that sound, like a metronome keeping time. If this were a movie, there would be ominous music. In reality, there's just the hum of a radiator and someone coughing in the hallway. History, inconveniently, is often very boring right up until it isn't. The phrasing of these orders matters. Words like relocation, special handling, or security measures slide easily across the page. You might even admire the efficiency. A quirky tidbit that tends to surprise people is that some documents use recycled paper or reused letterheads from completely unrelated departments, meaning the same sheet might once have announced a staff picnic before being turned into something far darker. Paper shortages during the war made even atrocity bureaucratic and thrifty. Nothing says dystopia quite like genocide on the back of a reused memo. That's joke number one, dark, but still technically a joke. You keep reading. The language feels distant, almost polite. That distance is the point. It creates a buffer between action and consequence. You're not told to hurt anyone. You're told to comply. You're told this is necessary, temporary, for the greater good. Historians still argue whether this linguistic fog was deliberately designed to protect the conscience of those involved, or whether it simply evolved from existing bureaucratic habits. Either way, the effect is the same. Responsibility becomes blurry, like text viewed through frosted glass. As you drift deeper into this world of forms and signatures, you notice how many people touch a single order. One writes it, another copies it, another files it, another delivers it. By the time it reaches its destination, it feels less like a command and more like a fact of nature, like rain or gravity. You wouldn't argue with gravity. You just adjust your posture and move on. There's joke number two. Gravity has better PR than most war criminals. You might be tempted to tell yourself you would notice. You would refuse. You would stand up dramatically, knocking over your chair, delivering a speech that later generations would quote. The uncomfortable truth is that most people in these systems did not experience a single, clear moral crossroads. Instead, you feel nudged gently, repeatedly, until you're somewhere you never planned to be. The extraordinary grows out of the ordinary, like mold in a forgotten lunchbox. That's joke number 3, and also a reminder to clean your fridge. A well-known fact is that after the war, many perpetrators insisted they were just following orders. This phrase became so common that it almost lost meaning, yet it highlights something crucial: the power of systems to reshape individual behavior. The orders themselves often reference laws or decrees, giving them a veneer of legitimacy. If it's legal, it must be right, or at least not your problem. You feel how tempting that logic is, especially when dissent carries risk and obedience brings routine safety. You glance at the clock on the wall. It's almost lunch. This too is important. Atrocities are planned between coffee breaks. Someone worries about being late home. Someone else thinks about soup. The coexistence of normal life and monstrous outcomes is not a contradiction. It's a warning. Scholars still debate how much personal belief versus situational pressure drove compliance, but there's broad agreement that the system itself was designed to make refusal feel abnormal, even irrational. As you sit with these thoughts, your breathing slows. The room remains quiet. The paper does not accuse. It waits. You realize that understanding these orders isn't about memorizing dates or names. It's about recognizing how easily structure can anesthetize empathy. And as your eyes grow heavy, you let that realization settle gently, not as a jolt, but as a soft, unsettling hum beneath the surface. You don't leave the office. You simply drift down a hallway, following the invisible path an order takes once it's signed. It moves not as a shout, but as a whisper, sliding neatly into folders, briefcases, and minds. This is the chain of command, and you are now walking alongside it, step by careful step. At the top, the language is abstract and strategic. As it descends, it grows sharper, colder, more practical. By the time it reaches the bottom, it no longer sounds like an idea. It sounds like a task. You notice how comforting the hierarchy feels. Someone above you decided this, so you don't have to. That's the quiet bargain. In World War II, a well-established historical fact is that military and police structures were deliberately rigid, emphasizing obedience as a virtue above almost everything else. Orders flowed downward, and responsibility was expected to dissolve along the way, like sugar stirred into hot tea. Sweet at first, then gone. If only morality dissolved so easily. You imagine yourself as a mid-level officer, not powerful enough to set policy, not low enough to feel entirely trapped. This is the most dangerous position of all. You translate vague directives into concrete actions. You don't think of yourself as cruel. You think of yourself as accurate, precise, efficient. The system rewards you for that. Promotions rarely go to people who ask too many questions. They go to people who keep things moving. There's joke number 1. Nothing greases a career like well-oiled indifference. As the order travels, it's repeated again and again, each time slightly altered to fit local circumstances. This repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity dulls alarm. You've heard this before. You've signed something like this before. A quirky but revealing tidbit is that some units develop their own shorthand or nicknames for grim tasks, turning horror into workplace slang. When something has a nickname, it feels manageable, like a project instead of a crime. That's not humor. That's coping masquerading as efficiency. You sense how authority presses down gently but constantly. No one needs to threaten you every day. The structure itself does the work. Uniforms, salutes, titles, and rituals reinforce the idea that disobedience is not just wrong, but unthinkable. Historians still argue whether most participants were true believers in ideology or simply conformists swept along by institutional momentum. The uncomfortable answer may be that it didn't matter. The machine ran smoothly either way. You pause at a staircase, watching the order move downward. At each level, someone tells themselves a story. This is temporary. This is necessary. This is not my decision. These stories act like earplugs, muffling the sound of conscience. You feel how tempting it would be to insert your own version. Maybe you'd say, if I don't do it, someone worse will. That sentence has been very busy throughout history. It deserves its own pension. There is also fear, but it's rarely dramatic. It's subtle. Fear of being reassigned, fear of standing out, fear of becoming the problem instead of solving one. A mainstream fact often cited is that severe penalties for disobedience were less common than people assume, yet the perception of danger was enough to keep most people compliant. The threat didn't need to be constant. It just needed to be believable. As the order reaches the lowest ranks, it becomes brutally simple. Do this. Go there. Move them. Guard this. At this point, the language has lost all abstraction. The task is physical, immediate, and yet even here the chain of command offers psychological cover. You were told to do this. You didn't invent it. You're just the last link. Like the last domino, you fall because everyone else already has. You notice how rarely anyone looks back up the chain. Looking up might invite questions, and questions slow things down. The system values speed and compliance, not reflection. There's joke number 2. Bureaucracy hates philosophy almost as much as it hates handwritten notes. In this structure, responsibility is everywhere and nowhere at once. Each person carries a fragment so small it feels weightless. But together, those fragments crush. Scholars still debate how awareness of outcomes varied across ranks, but there is agreement that the compartmentalization of tasks made it easier for individuals to avoid seeing the whole picture. You don't feel like an executioner if you're only scheduling transport. You don't feel like a murderer if you're only guarding a door. As you continue along this invisible path, your body relaxes even as your thoughts darken. The repetition becomes almost hypnotic. Order given, order received, order executed. It has a rhythm like marching feet or a ticking clock. Tick, tick. That sound again. Remember the stamp from earlier? It's still echoing, softer now, but persistent. You realize that the chain of command doesn't just transmit orders. It transmits permission. Permission to stop thinking. Permission to stop feeling. And once granted, that permission is hard to revoke. As your breathing slows, you sit with the uneasy knowledge that the extraordinary cruelty of the era did not require extraordinary people. Only ordinary ones, standing in line, waiting for instructions, trusting that someone else had thought it through. You don't notice the change at first. The hallway sounds the same, the papers feel the same, but the words begin to shift. This is where language quietly does its work. You hear people stop using names and start using categories. Not Anna or David, not a family or a neighbor, but a unit, a group, a problem. You are still in the present, still listening, as sentences grow smoother and emptier at the same time. This is the language of dehumanization, and it wraps itself around you like a blanket that's a little too heavy. A mainstream historical fact is that World War II regimes relied heavily on euphemistic and technical language to describe violent actions. Words were chosen carefully, not to explain, but to obscure. When people are reduced to terms like elements or cases, they begin to feel less like humans and more like paperwork. You feel how this makes everything easier. You can process a case, you can't as easily process a crying person. You imagine yourself listening to a briefing. The tone is calm, instructional, almost boring. That's intentional. Emotional language might provoke hesitation. Neutral language keeps things moving. You notice how often passive voice appears. Things must be done. People are to be relocated. No subject, no agent, no one doing the doing. Historians still argue whether this linguistic style was consciously engineered to dull moral resistance, or whether it simply mirrored existing administrative habits. But its effectiveness is not in doubt. There's a strange comfort in jargon. It makes you feel like a professional, part of an in-group that understands how things really work. A quirky tidbit from the era is that some officials prided themselves on inventing especially tidy phrases for ugly realities, as if elegance of wording could somehow civilize the act itself. It's like putting a lace doily over a mess and pretending the mess has improved. Joke number 1. Nothing says respectable like atrocities with good grammar. And as the words change, so do perceptions. You notice how repetition turns strangeness into normalcy. The first time you hear a term, it jars you. The 10th time, it barely registers. By the 100th, it feels inevitable. You start using it yourself, not because you believe it deeply, but because it's convenient. Everyone else understands it. That's how language recruits you without asking. You overhear conversations where people speak in shorthand. A glance, a nod, a phrase clip of short. Full explanations aren't necessary anymore. This efficiency is praised, time saved, effort reduced. A well-known fact is that many perpetrators later claimed emotional distance, saying they never saw victims as individuals. Language helped make that claim feel true, at least to themselves. You feel a subtle shift inside you. Not a dramatic hardening, but a gentle numbing. When words lose warmth, empathy follows. Scholars still debate whether dehumanizing language alone can cause violence or whether it merely enables it, but most agree it plays a critical role in lowering psychological barriers. It's easier to mistreat an abstraction than a person. Abstractions don't look back at you. There's also humor, oddly enough. Dark jokes circulate coded and indirect. Humor becomes another shield. Laughing at the terminology makes it feel less threatening, less real. There's joke number 2. If you can pun your way through a moral crisis, maybe it wasn't that serious. Except it was. You catch yourself thinking in the same terms. You don't mean to. It just happens. Language shapes thought, and thought shapes action. You begin to understand how quickly this process can unfold, not over generations, but over months, weeks, even days. The extraordinary cruelty of outcomes starts with ordinary shifts in vocabulary. You pause, noticing how quiet everything feels now. The words have done their job. There's less internal resistance, less friction. The system hums smoothly. You remember the stamp from before, the chain of command, and you see how they connect. Language is the oil that keeps the machinery from squeaking. A lesser-known tidbit is that after the war, many documents were scrutinized not just for what they ordered, but for how they phrased those orders. Investigators understood that words mattered. They always do. You wonder how many times in your own life you've softened something difficult with a nicer phrase. It is what it is. No hard feelings. Scaled up, those habits become dangerous. Historians still argue whether widespread use of dehumanizing language reflects genuine belief or performative conformity. But as you sit with this, you realize the distinction may not offer much comfort. The effect on victims is the same either way. Your breathing slows further. The words around you grow softer, more distant, as if muffled by layers of paper and time. You don't hear screams, you hear terminology. And that perhaps is the most unsettling sound of all. As you let your eyes grow heavy, you carry with you the quiet understanding that before harm is done with hands, it is rehearsed with words, spoken calmly, repeated often, until they feel like nothing at all. You drift from spoken words back to paper, back to desks, back to the people who never held a weapon, yet moved history with quiet efficiency. You are standing beside a desk clerk now, watching hands that are clean, nails trimmed, cuffs neat. These hands do not tremble. They sort, file, stamp, and log. This is the world of desk clerks and rubber stamps. where atrocities are processed one document at a time, and where distance from the outcome feels like innocence. A mainstream historical fact is that vast portions of World War II atrocities depended on civilian and administrative labor. Clerks recorded names, addresses, quotas, and transfers. Without this administrative backbone, the machinery of violence would have stalled. Trains don't run, people don't disappear, and orders don't scale without someone keeping records. You notice how unremarkable the work looks. It resembles any office, anywhere, anytime. That familiarity is what makes it so dangerous. You imagine yourself in this role. You arrive in the morning, hang your coat, complain silently about the weather. There's a stack of files waiting. You don't read them closely. You don't need to. Your job is to ensure they move from left to right, from inbox to outbox. Efficiency is praised. Accuracy is rewarded. Moral reflection is not part of the job description. Joke number 1, the employee handbook is very thorough, except for the part about humanity. The stamp comes down again. Thud. There's that sound. It's oddly satisfying, like popping bubble wrap, but with worse consequences. A quirky tidbit historians sometimes note is that different offices took pride in the clarity of their stamps and handwriting, competing informally to have the neatest records. Even in the middle of mass suffering, professionalism thrived. There is something chilling about people striving for excellence in the wrong direction. You sense how repetition dulls awareness. The first file might catch your attention. The 50th becomes routine. By the end of the week, you could process a name without even registering it as a person. Historians still argue whether this numbness was a psychological defense mechanism or simply the result of overwork and normalization. Either way, the outcome is the same. People become entries. There's a subtle pride here too. You're contributing, you're important. The system needs you. That feeling matters. It keeps you coming back, even when a small voice inside whispers that something isn't right. You quiet that voice by telling yourself you're replaceable. If you quit, someone else will sit at this desk tomorrow. Joke number 2, bureaucracy has excellent job security, especially for moral abdication. You glance at a ledger. Lines upon lines, names reduced to ink. Some clerks later claimed they never knew what happened to the people they recorded. Others clearly did. The distinction blurs. Knowledge exists on a spectrum, and many people occupy the comfortable middle where they know just enough to function, but not enough to feel fully responsible. Scholars still debate how much information clerks had access to, but few deny that the system allowed them not to ask. You notice how silence operates here. No one discusses outcomes. No one shares doubts aloud. The office culture discourages it without ever saying so. Conversations stay safe. Lunch plans, supply shortages, rumors about promotions. The absence of discussion becomes its own message. This is not a place for questions. This is a place for throughput. A lesser-known detail is that after the war, some former clerks expressed genuine shock when confronted with the full consequences of their paperwork. Seeing photographs, hearing testimony, connecting the dots, it overwhelmed them. Critics argue this shock was selective blindness. Defenders argue it was compartmentalization. Historians still argue whether compartmentalization should be considered a moral failure or a human limitation under extreme systems. You feel your shoulders relax as you stand there. The work is predictable. There's comfort in predictability. Atrocities thrive in predictability. You begin to understand that violence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, stamped and signed, filed away neatly before lunch. There's joke number 3, quieter than the others. The most dangerous weapon in the room is the stapler, because it holds everything together. You almost smile, then catch yourself. Humor, again, is a shield. As the day ends, the clerk locks the drawer, straightens the desk, and goes home. Dinner is eaten. Sleep comes. Tomorrow, the drawer will be opened again. The system never sleeps, but the people inside it do, and that may be the most unsettling part. Ordinary rest after extraordinary harm. You let that image soften as your breathing slows. Papers stacked neatly, stamps cleaned, lights turned off. In the quiet, you realize how much damage can be done without anyone ever raising their voice. And as you sink deeper into rest, you carry with you the uneasy awareness that sometimes the most devastating acts are carried out by people who never leave their chairs. You don't see uniforms first. You see morning light creeping through a window, dust floating lazily in the air. Someone yawns. Someone buttons a shirt. This is how it starts again. Not with ideology, not with rage, but with a normal morning. You are walking alongside people who will later be called perpetrators. But right now they are just men waking up, stretching sore backs, wondering if there will be enough coffee. Normal men, normal mornings. That ordinariness is the most disturbing detail of all. A mainstream historical fact is that many individuals involved in World War II atrocities lived otherwise conventional lives. They had families, hobbies, favorite foods. Some wrote affectionate letters home the same day they participated in violence images. You feel the dissonance settle in your chest. The human brain is very good at building walls between compartments. Breakfast here, atrocity there. No overlap, at least not on the surface. You imagine yourself waking up in this world. The bed is a little uncomfortable. The room smells faintly of soap and wool. You think about the day ahead in practical terms. What time do you need to leave? Will it rain? The task you will later perform does not yet feel real. It's just another duty, another shift. There's joke number one. Evil rarely skips breakfast, but it also rarely announces itself before coffee. You watch these men eat, talk, complain. Some grumble about their assignments. Others boast quietly. Most say very little at all. Silence is safer. A quirky tidbit that often surprises listeners is that some perpetrators were avid music lovers or amateur artists, carrying sketchbooks or instruments with them. The same hands that could draw a careful landscape could also carry out orders without visible hesitation. This contradiction doesn't make sense, and that's exactly the point. You feel an urge to separate yourself from them, to say, I'm not like that. Historians caution against this instinct. Scholars still argue whether personality traits or situational pressures played the dominant role, but many agree that placing perpetrators in a category of monsters is emotionally comforting and historically misleading. Monsters don't need systems. Humans do. The morning routine continues. Boots laced, papers checked, a brief moment of boredom. Boredom is important. Boredom dulls the edges of moral awareness. When something becomes routine, it stops demanding your full attention. You notice how quickly the extraordinary becomes just another part of the day's schedule. There's joke number two. When cruelty makes it onto the to-do list, it's officially been normalized. You catch fragments of conversation, talk of weather, talk of home, talk of how this will all be over someday. Hope exists even here, and that hope coexists with harm in a way that feels impossible to reconcile. A well-documented fact is that many perpetrators saw themselves as temporary actors in an unpleasant necessity, convinced they would return to normal life afterward, untouched. History, unfortunately, keeps receipts. You walk with them as they leave their quarters. The world outside looks ordinary. Trees, roads, buildings. Nothing signals that something terrible is about to happen. This visual normalcy matters. It reassures. It tells you that the world is still intact, that whatever you are about to do cannot be that bad if the sky looks like this. you begin to understand how environment participates in moral anesthesia. There are moments, small and fleeting, when doubt flickers, a glance held too long, a pause before moving forward. These moments rarely last. They are smoothed over by group momentum, by jokes, by orders, by the sheer fact of everyone else continuing to walk. Scholars still debate how often such moments occurred and how often they were consciously suppressed. But the evidence suggests they were common and usually fleeting. You think about fear again, but this time it's not fear of punishment. It's fear of isolation, of being the odd one out, of disrupting the fragile social balance of the group. Humans are deeply social creatures. We take cues from each other constantly. If everyone else seems fine, you assume you should be too. There's joke number 3. Peer pressure didn't end in high school. It just got uniforms. As the day unfolds, the morning version of these men fades. Tasks replace thoughts. Action replaces reflection. By evening, the memory of breakfast feels distant, almost irrelevant. That's another trick of time. It compresses moral distance. What felt unthinkable at dawn feels accomplished by dusk. A lesser-known detail is that some perpetrators later described feeling relief at the end of the day. Not relief that the task was done, but relief that they could return to familiar routines. Dinner, sleep, letters home. Normality becomes a reward, reinforcing the cycle. Do the unthinkable, then retreat into the ordinary as if it balances the scale. You stand back and take this in. No single moment defines these men. No single choice explains everything. Instead, there is a chain of small, unremarkable decisions, each one easier than the last. Historians still argue whether moral collapse happens gradually or whether it requires a decisive internal break. But watching this, it feels gradual, almost imperceptible. Your breathing slows as the day winds down. The light fades. The men you followed lie down to sleep. Somewhere paperwork is filed. Somewhere a stamp is cleaned. The system resets for tomorrow. And as you drift toward rest yourself, you are left with the unsettling awareness that the capacity for extraordinary harm does not require extraordinary evil. Only ordinary people, waking up, getting dressed, and deciding, again and again, not to stop. You feel the rhythm before you see it, a low vibration under your feet, steady and indifferent. When you step outside, it becomes clearer, steel on steel, wheels turning, time divided into neat blocks. You are standing beside railways and timetables now, where violence learns to run on schedule. Nothing here feels rushed. Nothing feels chaotic. Everything moves exactly when it is supposed to. A mainstream historical fact is that rail networks played a central role in World War II atrocities, especially in mass deportations. Trains made it possible to move enormous numbers of people efficiently, predictably, and with minimal personnel. This wasn't improvisation. It was logistics. The same systems used to deliver coal and mail were repurposed to transport human beings, and the trains did not know the difference. You imagine yourself holding a timetable. It's precise, almost elegant. Departure times, arrival times, platform numbers. You focus on the numbers because numbers are soothing. Numbers don't cry. Numbers don't beg. You're not thinking about who is on the train, only whether it will be late. There's joke number 1. Nothing says civilization like punctual horror. You notice how many people are involved, none of whom feel central. Signal operators, dispatchers, engineers, each one performs a small task, often far from the destination. The engineer sees tracks, not passengers. The dispatcher sees symbols on a board. The clerk sees cargo codes. The system fragments responsibility so thoroughly that no single person feels like the driver of events. even though everyone is literally helping things move. A quirky tidbit that still unsettles historians is that some transport officials complained about overcrowding not because of human suffering, but because it damaged rail cars and reduced efficiency. Human beings were measured against wear and tear on equipment. When that comparison feels reasonable inside a system, something has gone deeply wrong. You watch a train arrive, steam hisses, metal groans. It looks like any other arrival. People nearby barely glance up. Trains arrive and depart all day. Routine is the camouflage. Historians still argue whether railway workers fully understood the destinations and outcomes of these transports, but many agree that enough people knew enough for the system to function smoothly. Knowledge was present, but it was diffuse, spread thinly across many roles. You feel how timetables discipline behavior. If something is scheduled, it feels inevitable. You don't question sunrise. You don't question gravity. And eventually you stop questioning departures. The clock dictates action. If you hesitate, the schedule suffers. If the schedule suffers, someone will ask why. Accountability flows upward, but consequences rarely do. There's a strange pride in smooth operation. A train that runs on time is a small victory. You hear people congratulate each other for efficiency, for solving bottlenecks, for keeping things moving despite shortages. That pride becomes a moral anesthetic. You focus on the challenge of coordination rather than the purpose of the coordination. There's joke number 2. When you gamify logistics, you can forget what the pieces represent. You recall the rule book from earlier, the desk clerks, the language. All of it converges here. The railway is where abstraction becomes motion. Once people are on the move, events feel irreversible. Momentum replaces deliberation. It's harder to stop something that's already rolling, especially when stopping it would disrupt so many interconnected parts. A well-known fact is that even during intense wartime strain, extraordinary effort was made to keep these transport systems running. Resources were scarce, yet priority was often given to these movements. That priority reveals intent more clearly than any speech. What a system chooses to sustain under pressure tells you what it values. You imagine yourself standing on a platform, clipboard in hand. You check off a box, train departed, on time. You might even feel relief. One less problem to solve today. That relief is dangerous. It teaches you that completion is success, regardless of content. Scholars still debate whether the banality of these tasks made resistance less likely, but it's clear that routinization played a powerful role. There are moments when things go wrong. Delays, mechanical failures. You feel irritation ripple through the system, not because people are suffering, but because the machine is stalling. Fixing the delay becomes urgent. The human cargo remains abstract, secondary. Efficiency reasserts itself as the highest good. You hear the whistle fade into the distance. The platform empties. Silence returns. On paper, everything looks fine. On the schedule, everything aligns. The violence is now elsewhere, downstream, out of sight. This spatial separation matters. Distance dulls responsibility. If you don't see the end, you can pretend you're not part of it. A lesser-known detail is that after the war, some transport workers expressed genuine shock at learning the full scope of what their timetables enabled. Others were less surprised. Memory is selective. Historians still argue how much disbelief was sincere and how much was a convenient reconstruction. The documents, however, remain stubbornly clear. As you step away from the tracks, your breathing slows again. The steady rhythm of the rails lingers in your body, almost like a lullaby. It's unsettling how calming it feels. Motion without reflection, progress without purpose. You understand now how extraordinary cruelty can travel quietly, carried by systems designed for order. arriving on time, every time. The trains keep running in your mind as your eyes grow heavy. Schedules flipping pages, clocks ticking forward. You drift with that rhythm, aware that some of the darkest journeys in history were powered not by chaos, but by coordination. And that is a thought that settles heavily, then slowly fades into the background hum of sleep. You don't travel far this time. The rails fade, the timetables fold away, and you find yourself in familiar streets. Shops you recognize, houses with curtains drawn just so. This is where the machinery meets the neighborhood. Local collaboration is rarely announced with banners. It slips in quietly through favors, forms, introductions, in the simple fact that everyone knows everyone else. You are walking through a place that feels ordinary, and that is precisely why it matters. A mainstream historical fact is that across occupied Europe, local authorities and civilians were often involved, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, in identifying, registering, or assisting in the removal of targeted populations. This involvement varied widely by region, but it was common enough to be a defining feature of how the system operated. Large-scale violence depends on local knowledge. Someone has to know who lives where. You imagine yourself as a local official. You didn't design the policy, you didn't write the law. You're told to help implement it. Maybe it's a list, maybe it's a map, maybe it's just confirming a name. You tell yourself it's minor, administrative. Besides, refusing would draw attention, and attention is risky. There's this joke number one. Nothing makes you feel small quite like being told your cooperation is just a formality. You notice how pressure and incentive mix together. Some people comply out of fear, others out of opportunism, some out of long-held prejudice that now feels officially endorsed. A quirky tidbit that often surprises people is that in certain places, neighbors settled old grudges or gained property through collaboration, using the system to their advantage. Atrocity didn't just destroy lives, it reshuffled local power dynamics. You watch as information flows upward, names whispered, doors pointed out, habits described. They usually come home late. They live above the bakery. This intimacy is chilling. Violence becomes personal, not through emotion, but through familiarity. You feel how the distance created by bureaucracy collapses here. The abstraction gains an address. There is also reluctance, hesitation, quiet discomfort. Not everyone collaborates eagerly. Many comply minimally, doing just enough to avoid trouble. Historians still argue whether such minimal compliance should be considered resistance or participation. The moral math is uncomfortable. If you give less information than you could, are you helping or hindering? The answer shifts depending on perspective and consequence. You sense how normalization works locally. When authorities ask, it feels official. When neighbors comply, it feels acceptable. Social proof fills the gaps where conscience might otherwise speak up. You notice how quickly silence becomes a form of agreement. People stop talking about those who disappear. Empty houses become part of the scenery. Life adjusts. There's a quiet tragedy in how ordinary routines absorb shock. The shop opens the next day. Children still play. The absence is noticed, then folded into daily life. There's joke number two, gentle and sad. Humans are excellent at adapting, even when adaptation is the problem. You overhear conversations framed as practicality. What else could we do? We have families. It's not our decision. These phrases echo what you have heard before, just closer to home now. The same logic scales down as easily as it scales up. The chain of command may start far away, but its links are forged locally. A lesser-known detail is that in some communities, collaboration and resistance existed side by side. sometimes within the same person over time. Someone might comply one day and quietly help someone hide the next. This inconsistency frustrates historians who want clear categories. Scholars still debate whether human behavior under occupation is best understood as moral failure, survival strategy, or something messier that resists neat labels. You feel the weight of personality. It's easier to deny responsibility when you're far from the outcome. Here, that distance shrinks, and yet denial persists. You tell yourself you're not the one doing the harm. You're just passing along information, just following instructions. Those phrases have traveled well. There is also the lure of belonging. Cooperation can bring favor, safety, even status. Being seen as reliable matters. Being seen as difficult does not. You understand how subtle rewards can be as powerful as threats. There's joke number 3. Carrots work just as well as sticks, especially when everyone's hungry. You pause at a doorway, imagining the moment someone knocks. That knock is the end of a long process that began with paperwork and schedules. By the time it arrives, it feels inevitable. Local collaboration didn't create the system, but it completed it. Without local hands, the machine would grind and stall. After the war, these communities had to live with what happened. Neighbors looked at neighbors. Memory became contested terrain. Some remembered resistance. Others remembered survival. Some remembered nothing at all. Historians still argue about collective guilt versus individual responsibility. And those arguments often mirror the discomfort of communities trying to move forward without fully looking back. You step away from the street as your breathing slows. The familiar setting makes everything feel heavier. It's one thing to imagine distant offices and railways. It's another to imagine your own neighborhood. That closeness lingers as you drift toward rest, a quiet reminder that extraordinary harm often relies on ordinary places, ordinary people, and the small, everyday choices made when no one is watching too closely. You don't move this time. You stand still, and that stillness becomes the point. Around you, things happen or don't, and both matter. This is the space of looking away, of not asking, of choosing silence as a kind of shelter. You are present, close enough to sense that something is wrong, but far enough to pretend you don't know exactly what. This is where many people spent the war. Not acting, not resisting, not ordering, just not seeing. A mainstream historical fact is that large portions of civilian populations in World War II were aware, at least in fragments, that something terrible was happening. Rumors circulated, smoke was seen, people disappeared, yet full acknowledgement was often avoided. Knowledge existed in pieces, and those pieces were rarely assembled into a whole picture. You feel how convenient that fragmentation is. If you don't know everything, you can tell yourself you know nothing. You imagine yourself overhearing whispers. A neighbor lowers their voice. A friend changes the subject. You learn quickly which questions make people uncomfortable. So you stop asking. Silence becomes a shared language. It says, I won't challenge you if you won't challenge me. There's joke number 1. Denial is the most popular group project in history. You notice how attention can be directed elsewhere. War offers many distractions, shortages, bombings, personal loss. Focusing on your own survival feels reasonable, even virtuous. A quirky tidbit historians sometimes mention is that in some areas, people deliberately adjusted daily routes or schedules to avoid seeing troubling sights. You can't unsee what you never see in the first place. You feel the weight of fear again and again, but this time it's diffuse. Fear of being wrong, fear of overreacting, fear of misinterpreting signs. Historians still argue whether widespread inaction was driven more by fear of reprisal or by psychological denial, but the result was the same. Silence filled the gaps where action might have been. You watch how language changes here too. People speak in hints. They've been taken. Something happened. Passive voice returns, doing its quiet work. No subject, no agent. Events just occur. This linguistic fog makes it easier to stay detached. If no one is doing anything, then no one is responsible. That logic spreads quickly. There's also a moral fatigue that sets in. When bad news is constant, it loses its urgency. Each new rumor feels less shocking than the last. You adapt. You always do. There's joke number 2, weary but true. Humans can get used to almost anything, given enough repetition and just enough distance. You notice moments when looking away is an active choice. You hear a sound and decide not to investigate. You see something out of place and keep walking. These are small decisions, but they accumulate. Scholars still debate how much moral weight to assign to inaction, especially under oppressive regimes. The question lingers: at what point does not acting become a form of participation? You think about the comfort of normalcy. Maintaining routines feels like resistance to chaos, but it can also be a way of cooperating with head. Shops open, meals are cooked, life continues. This continuation reassures you that things can't be that bad. If they were, surely everything would stop. History suggests otherwise. A lesser-known detail is that after the war, many witnesses expressed genuine shock at revelations, even when evidence had been visible for years. Some historians interpret this as sincere compartmentalization. Others see it as retrospective self-protection. Memory is flexible, especially when it needs to be. You feel the tension between empathy and self-preservation. Looking directly at suffering carries risk. Emotional, social, sometimes physical. Looking away feels safer. That safety is seductive. There's joke number 3, soft and uneasy. Ignorance isn't bliss, but it does come with fewer sleepless nights. As you stand there not moving, you realize that silence is not empty. It's full of decisions not made, questions not asked, paths not taken. The system depends on this quiet just as much as it depends on orders and schedules. Without witnesses choosing silence, the noise of protest might have grown louder. Your breathing slows further. The world around you feels muted, as if padded. Sounds are distant, shapes blur. In this calm, you sit with the uncomfortable understanding that looking away is rarely neutral. It shapes outcomes, even when it feels passive. And as you drift closer to sleep, you hold that awareness gently, letting it settle without panic, knowing that history's loudest crimes were often accompanied by a great, heavy quiet. You begin to sense how nothing here happens all at once. There is no single leap from ordinary to horrific. Instead, there are steps, small, measured, almost polite. This is incremental brutality, the slow normalization of harm through repetition and adjustment. You are still present, still moving forward, but each movement feels barely noticeable. That's the trick. If each step is small enough, you never feel the ground drop away. A mainstream historical fact is that many World War II atrocities escalated gradually. Policies hardened over time, restrictions tightened, violence intensified in phases. What began as exclusion became confinement, then forced labor, then something far worse. Each stage was framed as a response to necessity, to circumstance, to the failure of the previous step. You feel how this logic creates momentum. If the last measure didn't work, the next one must be stronger. You imagine yourself adapting along the way. The first change feels uncomfortable. You notice it, you discuss it quietly, then it becomes routine. The second change arrives and you compare it not to your original values, but to the previous step. Compared to yesterday, today doesn't seem that bad. There's joke number 1. Moral erosion is a lot like adjusting to cold water. You don't scream if you wade in slowly. You watch how thresholds shift. Actions that once would have caused outrage now barely register. Language helps here too. Terms are softened, then abbreviated, then replaced. The mind follows the vocabulary. A quirky tidbit historians sometimes point out is that officials occasionally express concern about public reaction, not to the harm itself, but to its visibility, leading to changes designed to make brutality less noticeable rather than less severe. Out of sight becomes out of mind by design. You feel how routines absorb shock. When something happens every day, it stops feeling exceptional. It becomes background. This is not because people become evil overnight, but because repetition rewires expectation. Scholars still argue whether desensitization alone can account for participation in extreme violence, or whether it must be paired with ideology and pressure. The consensus leans toward all of the above, which is deeply unsatisfying and deeply human. You recall earlier moments, the stamps, the schedules, the silence. Incremental brutality ties them together. Each part reinforces the others. When harm is divided into steps, no single step feels decisive. You're never forced to confront the whole. You're only asked to accept the next adjustment. There's joke number 2. If you're only ever asked to move the line a little, you might not notice when you have crossed it entirely. You notice how justifications evolve. Early on, actions are framed as temporary, later as necessary, later still as deserved. The narrative hardens alongside the policy. Once people are seen as a problem, solutions naturally become harsher. A well-documented fact is that escalation often followed perceived resistance or inefficiency, with brutality presented as the logical fix. Violence markets itself as problem-solving. You imagine moments of internal resistance that flicker and fade. This is getting worse. This isn't what I signed up for. Those thoughts appear, but they are quickly crowded out by the reality that you are already involved. Turning back would require admitting past complicity. That's a heavy burden. Historians still debate how much sunk cost thinking influenced continued participation, but the psychological pull of consistency is strong. Humans prefer to believe they have always been reasonable. You watch as boundaries blur. What was once forbidden becomes tolerated. What was tolerated becomes expected. What was expected becomes enforced. This progression doesn't feel dramatic when you're inside it. It feels administrative. Adjustments to guidelines, updates to procedures, new norms. There's joke number 3, quiet and uneasy. The scariest words in a meeting are, "We've always done it this way." You think about how this affects perception of victims. As treatment worsens, empathy often decreases rather than increases. Harsh conditions are reframed as evidence of inferiority or guilt. This reversal protects the conscience. If they're suffering, it must be because they deserve it, or so the story goes. Scholars still argue whether cruelty breeds contempt or contempt breeds cruelty. The answer may be that they feed each other in a closed loop. You feel the pace of time change. Days blur together. Each day contains something that would once have been shocking, but now barely causes a pause. This is how extraordinary harm becomes mundane. Not through passion, but through process. Not through hatred alone, but through habit. A lesser-known detail is that some individuals later described a moment when they realized things had gone too far. But that realization often came after the worst had already happened. Recognition lagged behind action. Memory caught up late. Regret arrived even later. That lag is part of the tragedy. You stand with this realization as your breathing slows. Incremental brutality doesn't announce itself. It invites you to adjust, to accommodate, to keep going just a little longer. And because each step is survivable, you survive them all until you look back and barely recognize the path you have taken. As your eyes grow heavy, the steps soften into a gentle rhythm. Small steps, repeated steps, a path worn smooth by use. You let the thoughts settle without panic, understanding that history's greatest horrors often arrive not with a single thunderclap, but with a series of quiet, reasonable steps, each one easier than the last. The story slows now, like footsteps fading down a long corridor after the lights have been turned low. You are no longer standing at the desk, no longer holding the pen. Instead, you are drifting, carried gently by the awareness that history is not only something loud and distant, but something quiet and close, something that happens when ordinary moments go unquestioned. That thought might sound heavy, but here in this softened space, it becomes oddly calming. Understanding does not need to shout. Sometimes it simply rests beside you. Your breathing evens out as you remember that you are safe, here and now, listening in the present while the past dissolves into memory. The orders, the uniforms, the routines, all of them begin to blur, losing their sharp edges. They become lessons rather than threats, reminders rather than warnings. You don't need to solve them tonight. You don't need to judge or analyze anymore. You can let them sit quietly, like old books placed back on a shelf. You notice how the world around you feels smaller and gentler again. The hum of a fan, the distant sound of traffic, or maybe crickets, or nothing at all. History exhales and so do you. Whatever weight you carried while listening can be set down now. You are not responsible for fixing the past in this moment. Your only task is rest. As your thoughts soften, you may realize something comforting. Awareness is not the same as fear. Knowing how fragile ordinary life can be does not mean you must be tense. It simply means you are human, capable of reflection, capable of choosing gentleness when it matters. That realization settles warmly, like a blanket pulled just high enough. The images fade further. Paper turns blank. Voices quiet. Even time seems to loosen its grip. You are allowed to drift, to let the story end without urgency, without noise. Nothing more is required of you tonight. So rest now. Let your mind wander slowly, peacefully, away from history and into sleep, where thoughts lose their edges and everything becomes calm, dim, and soft.